Hello and welcome for another Tune for Media lesson. And today we're going to mix some rock drums. These are my tracks recorded in my humble studio. So we have kick, snare top, snare bottom, floor tom, rec tom, hi-hat, overheads, and room mics. And everything is zero and flattened, and this is how it sounds. Alright, so I think it's a pretty good start. Kind of like how it sounds right now. Obviously, the room mics are a little bit overshadowing the other mics, and it sounds really natural, but it's a little bit unbalanced, and it obviously sounds like it's not mixed. Alright, so the first step that I'm usually doing when I want to get this big, punchy, rocky, modern sound is to put gate on the closed mic. So the closed mics are the kick, snare top, snare bottom, floor tom, and rec tom. The hi-hat is technically also a closed mic, but I'm treating the hi-hat in a different way. So let me show you a cool trick to put the gate on the kick, and then I'm gonna do pretty much the same for the other tracks. So first of all, I'm looking for a soft kick, and I'm trying to kind of look for the softest I can find. There you go. This seems very soft, this one. So I'm gonna take this as a reference, and I want to make sure that the softest kick will make it through the gate. So I'm gonna take this area, loop it. I'm gonna bring up dynamics, noise gate, and I'll put it on 100 millisecond release. And I also want the look ahead to be 2 milliseconds and the attack to be 1. So I want to make sure that I'm not losing some of the attack from the kick drum. And I'm going to bring the threshold up to 0. And I like dialing backward till I can hear all of the kick drums. All right, so -20, it's a pretty good sweet spot in this case because I'm able to get each single kick and still nothing from the snare leaks the kick drum track. All right, so I'm gonna do the same for all the other closed mics, and I'm gonna speed it up to save some time. Okay, and now let's just listen to something before the gate and then after. So that's pretty radical, right? It's like the drums are very, very choked and dried and very punchy right now. What I'm aiming for is that the closed mic will provide the punch and the fullness, and the overheads and room mics will glue everything back together to a complete drum set. Okay, so the next step is EQ. So let's start with the kick drum. So it's a pretty small kick drum played in a pretty small room, pretty small setup. I'm gonna boost a little bit from the low end and maybe cut a little bit from the low mid and boost a little bit from the high mid to get that snap sound. And if it's not enough, I might add a trigger, and this is something that we'll talk about later. I like it. Let's go to the snare top. I'm gonna cut from the low end around 100. I'm also gonna boost around 200 to get this big body. And also to get this snap, I'm gonna get it from around 4,000. And some of the sizzle from around 8K. That sounds great. Snare bottom, I'm gonna cut quite a lot from the low end because I want to use mostly the top frequencies to add this kind of sizzle and to complete the sound of the snare top. And if it's not enough for me, again, it's a small setup, so sometimes I want to get this big drum sound. I might use extra trigger on the snare. I'm gonna boost a lot from 8K. Let me check them together, and I'll also check the phase between them, even though I already did that in the tracking stage. But when you do EQ, the phase is actually changing, so it's good to actually make sure that you're in good phase. Here's a good trick to check the phase. I'm taking this very, very narrow loop, so it's gonna be crazy. It's gonna be like a machine gun. And now I'm going to invert the phase, and the effect will be obvious because it's so fast. You can actually hear the effect, pretty obvious. See that? When the phase is flipped, it actually have a little more low end. So I might record these drums with a bad phase. So, or maybe because of the EQ, we actually got it out of phase. So let's just balance them together. Sounds pretty good. And I'm using now round numbers, but later when I mix it, especially with the song, with different elements, I'm going to forget about round numbers. Right now, the round numbers are just here for me to kind of have a good start, guiding start for the mix. Let's go to the floor tom. Now, the floor tom is a pretty small floor tom, and it's not tuned crazy low, although I like the floor tom to have this big subby rumble, so I'm gonna boost it pretty extreme. I'm gonna go pretty extreme with the low boost. And I'm gonna bring out the snap a little bit, around the 7K. Pretty nice. I'm gonna pan it because I want the toms to be panned, and I'm gonna bring that down a little bit. All right, let's go to the rack tom. And again, I'm gonna pan it like around 20 to the right. I just kind of pan between the toms. Now for the hi-hat, I'm gonna cut a lot from the low end, and basically I'm just gonna leave the area of the treble just to help the hi-hat in the general mix to cut through. Sometimes you can go more surgical about the hi-hat microphone, and you can remove it when the hi-hat isn't playing. Most of the time I like to keep it no matter what, because it adds something to the sound that sometimes you remove it, you feel like something is missing. I can actually go to a single band EQ. I don't need more than that. And just a low cut. And I'm gonna cut until I can hear mostly the hi-hat. It's kind of nice. So let's just add it to the mix. Now for the overheads and the room mics, I personally I don't touch them a lot. Kind of like the natural sound. I'm going for the natural sound. So for the overheads, I'm usually just cutting around 150. Just to eliminate this rumble. Just add it to the mix. And also I'm checking the phase from the snare top and the overheads. My go-to is if it sounds lower, it's probably the better position. Also with the kick. Let's hear it all together. Also have these tom grooves here, and let's hear it. Let's go to the room mic, see what we have. All right. So I'm gonna cut a little bit from the low end as well. I'm gonna start with 120. Maybe even a little less. And I have a frequency, an overtone from the snare that something in the room probably is noisy, and I don't like it. So I'm searching with a notch like that. Once I'll find it, I'll just cut it out. Like magic. And I'm bringing the room mic to the mix. Sounds great. For me, the room mic is extremely important. What brings this, excitement and big sound and natural sound. So if your setup is limited and you don't have enough inputs or mics, I would prefer give up on the hi-hat and the snare bottom in order to have a good room mic. Now that I can hear the entire drum set, I can determine if I want to use some triggers to pump up the sound of the kick in the snare. Let me try. So adding a trigger in Logic is pretty easy. You just select the track and you go to track and replace a double drum track. We'll be analyzing the channel. You select kick, and I'm searching for this, the soft one. I think it was, there you go, there it is. If I see it here, it means that minus 20 decibels in the threshold, it's pretty good. It will take it and it won't take the snare, and it's actually the same threshold that I put in the gate. So I click OK. Basically, this is just a MIDI track with a sampler on it, and this is just a sample. Now I like the default sample that Logic provides. It's actually, I think it's the most balanced one. it adds exactly what I need. Just a little bit of snap and a lot of sub and low end. So this is the trigger, and let's just mix it together with the kick. See how it sounds. All right. I need to invert the phase because I inverted the phase of the kick. So, and when you put a trigger in Logic, it actually lock it in phase. So it sounds pretty big. I like to bounce this and make this a wave file because I prefer wave files when I'm editing. I will just create a wave file out of it. So now I can delete this, and now I have a trigger. So my kick definitely sounds bigger. I think I'm gonna add another trigger to the snare, so I'm doing the same. So again, this is the trigger. I'm going to remove a little bit from this ring. Great. And again, I'm gonna bounce it in place. Now I have a snare trigger just to reinforce the snare sound. Let's just hear the snare alone. Sounds pretty cool. So let's just listen to the drums. All right, sounds pretty good. So the next step is compression. Now, some people like to put the compressor before the EQ. Some people like it after the EQ. Some people like to put a compressor before the EQ and another compressor after the EQ. So there's a lot of approaches for compression. I personally prefer most of the time to put the compressor after the EQ. I'm looking for punch and roundness. I'm looking for consistency. So from the closed mics, I'm going to compress for punch and volume. So which means that it's going to be generally a slow attack and fast release compression. And for the overheads and room mic, the overheads, I'm going to just compress for roundness. And the room mic, I'm just going to compress it very heavy to bring out the room very fast as well. So let's start with the kick drum. So let's bring dynamic, compressor, and I like to choose the Studio Fat, which is some sort of a Logic version of 1176. It's a very fast and reactive compressor, great for drums. And sometimes I use the Platinum Digital if I don't want too much characteristics of the compressor. But if it's a rock sound, kind of like this 1176 style compressor, it brings in some nice harmonic distortions. I'm gonna put the limiter on, and I'm gonna start with extreme settings, and then I'm gonna dial it back until I'm happy. So I'm pretty happy with this compression. I'm gonna fast forward on all these closed mics and triggers because essentially pretty much the same type of compression. All right, so I compressed everything to pretty giant punch. So let me just show you how it sounds without the compression and then with. And this is just the closed mics and the triggers. Now with some compression. Sounds mega punchy. I'm not gonna compress the hi-hat. It's pretty consistent and it's just very soft treble area mic, and it's gonna be compressed anyway with the bus channel later. Now for the overheads, I'm just gonna lightly compress it with an SSL bus style compressor, and in Logic it's the vintage VCA, and I'm just gonna lightly compress it with auto release and attack. Pretty natural to make a rounder sound, especially with big hits and big cymbals. Sounds good to me. And now for the room mic, I'm going to compress it pretty heavy because I want to bring the room out. So I'm going to compress it pretty fast and heavy. And if you want to add some punch with the room mic, you can do some parallel compression. But in this case, I think I'm going to stick to just heavy compression because my drum set is already sound pretty giant in my opinion. So the room is just going to bring this big excitement, washy sound. So I just love the room mic. All right, so let's start from very heavy and pretty much keep it very heavy. You can definitely hear the room. So it's a pretty fast compressor and pretty heavy. So let's hear the entire drum set with the compression. You can definitely tell how much the room adds to the sound. It's pretty amazing. And next step is to send everything to a bus. I could have started with this stage, but yeah. Anyway, I'm going to select all of them. And in Logic, you can select all of them and do a create track stack, a summing stack. And let's just call it drums. It's the same as basically send everything to a bus, and you'll have an auxiliary channel or bus channel appears here. This is the more traditional way. I like the Logic way of just creating a track stack because it's essentially the same. You have a bus channel here, but it's also looks better because it's more elegant. You have just one channel like that. So speaking of elegant, I can also color them the same color. Now for my bus channel, two things that I like to put is, first thing that I like is I'm putting some EQ. I'm taking the vintage tube EQ, which is a Pultec style EQ, and I'm going to use this one. I'm going to use a little bit of a drive. Gonna add some nice harmonic distortion, like a tube style harmonic distortion, and I'm also gonna bring out the 10K a little bit, so to make the drums shine a little more, so to add some sizzle, and a little bit from the low end, around the 30 hertz. So it's pretty giant. Lastly, in the master bus, I'm gonna add another SSL type compressor. Gonna be automatic release. Again, it's just pretty light, maybe a little heavier than the overheads. The last step is adding some reverb. So I'm gonna add some sends, and it's gonna be for, I'm gonna add some sends to the snare top, snare trigger maybe a little bit, and the toms. So I'm gonna just select them, and I'm gonna add bus 2, and let's just call this bus reverb 1. And here I'm gonna select, if you're in Logic, the space designer in stereo. I like stereo reverbs. I'm gonna set it to 0 dB wet. My personal favorite is going to medium spaces, to rooms, and to Prince Hall 1. Also, I'm gonna bring down the size a little bit because, in my opinion, it's a little too large. So I brought it down to 70%. And I'm gonna bring up the pre-delay to around 20 milliseconds because I don't want the reverb to be exactly on the transient, because then it will be meshed a little bit into the transient. It will weaken the drums a little bit. So just want it to appear just 20 milliseconds after the transient. Will just, will preserve the big punch. All right, so now the trick is basically to bring it up until you can hear it and then bring it down a little bit. And there you have it. It's a pretty good drum sound, in my opinion. And of course, it's gonna be the balance is not gonna be rounded in numbers like that, and it's gonna change once it will be mixed with other instruments. But anyway, this is how it sounds. So have fun and thank you for watching. Don't forget to visit our website because there you can actually download these files and practice yourself. And stay tuned.